When Lucky Luciano's most trusted accountant, Giuseppe Romano, disappeared with $500,000 in 1937, the FBI expected a war. They prepared for shootouts, car bombs, and a trail of bodies across New York. Instead, they got silence. No violence, no public displays, no newspaper headlines. Romano simply vanished, along with his wife and 2 children. 6 months later, when the FBI found Romano's abandoned car at the docks, there was a single business card on the dashboard. It belonged to a funeral home in Sicily. The message was clear. Betraying Lucky Luciano didn't just end your life, it erased your entire existence from the world. To understand why the disappearance of one accountant sent shockwaves through every crime family in America, you have to understand who Lucky Luciano really was. He wasn't just another gangster with a gun and a bad temper. He was the man who took the bloody chaos of Prohibition-era gang wars and transformed it into the most sophisticated criminal organization the world had ever seen. Charles Luciano was born Salvatore Lucania in a small village in Sicily in 1897. His family brought him to New York when he was just 9 years old, settling in the crowded tenements of the Lower East Side. Like thousands of other immigrant children, young Charlie was supposed to work hard, stay out of trouble, and chase the American dream through legitimate means. But the streets had different plans for Charlie Luciano. By age 14, he was running numbers for local bookmakers. By 16, he was stealing cargo from the docks. By 20, he was working directly for Joe Masseria, one of the most powerful crime bosses in New York City. What set Luciano apart wasn't his willingness to use violence. Plenty of young criminals were eager to crack skulls and settle disputes with bullets. What made Luciano different was his ability to see the big picture. While other gangsters were focused on their next score or their next territory war, Luciano was studying the entire system. He watched the Castellamarese War tear New York's crime families apart in the late 1920s and early 1930s. He saw fortunes lost, territories abandoned, and dozens of capable criminals eliminated in senseless bloodshed. Most importantly, he saw opportunity. In 1931, Luciano made the moves that would reshape American organized crime forever. Working with a small group of allies, including Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, Luciano orchestrated the elimination of both Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, the 2 most powerful crime bosses in New York. But instead of declaring himself the new boss of bosses, Luciano did something revolutionary. He created the Commission, a governing body where the heads of New York's 5 crime families could meet to settle disputes, divide territories, and coordinate major operations. This wasn't just about stopping the violence, though that was certainly part of it. Luciano understood that constant warfare was bad for business. Every day spent fighting rivals was a day not spent making money. Every shooting brought police attention. Every public war made it harder to corrupt judges, bribe politicians, and operate the illegal businesses that generated real profits. Under Luciano's system, the 5 families operated more like corporations than street gangs. They had defined territories, established protocols for resolving conflicts, and clear chains of command. Most importantly, they had a system for making decisions that didn't involve automatic violence. The results were immediate and impressive. Profits increased dramatically. Police interference decreased substantially. The families could focus their energy on developing new revenue streams instead of defending their existing operations from constant attack. But creating this system was only half the challenge. Maintaining it required a different kind of authority. Luciano needed to demonstrate that there were consequences for violating the new order, and those consequences had to be severe enough to deter future violations. This is where Giuseppe Romano's story becomes crucial to understanding Luciano's method of control. Romano wasn't a street criminal or a low-level muscle. He was an educated man, a certified public accountant who had immigrated to America in the early 1920s. He spoke perfect English, understood complex financial systems, and had built a reputation for discretion and competence. When Luciano needed someone to manage the increasingly complicated financial aspects of his operations, Romano was the obvious choice. He was smart enough to handle the work, desperate enough for the money to ignore the risks, and isolated enough from the traditional Italian-American crime families to avoid conflicts of loyalty. For nearly 6 years, Romano managed millions of dollars for Luciano's organization. He handled the complex process of laundering money from illegal gambling, bootlegging, and loan sharking operations. He maintained accounts in multiple banks, arranged for the purchase of legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts, and coordinated the distribution of profits among the 5 families. Romano was also privy to information that could destroy not just Luciano, but the entire structure of organized crime in New York. He knew the real owners of dozens of apparently legitimate businesses. He could identify corrupt police officers, judges, and politicians who were receiving regular payments. He had detailed records of illegal operations across 5 states. This made Romano incredibly valuable to Luciano's organization. It also made him incredibly dangerous. By 1937, the federal government was increasing pressure on organized crime. The end of Prohibition had eliminated one major source of income, forcing criminal organizations to diversify into other illegal activities. This increased visibility brought increased law enforcement attention. Federal agents began approaching individuals connected to organized crime, offering immunity and protection in exchange for information. They targeted accountants, lawyers, and business associates who might have detailed knowledge of illegal operations, but weren't hardcore criminals themselves. Romano was an obvious target for federal investigators. He was educated enough to understand the legal implications of cooperation. He had access to detailed financial records that could support criminal prosecutions. Most importantly, he had family members who could be offered protection along with him. The FBI's approach to Romano was sophisticated and patient. They didn't make direct threats or demands. Instead, they gradually increased pressure over several months. They audited his personal tax returns. They questioned his neighbors about his activities. They made it clear that they knew about his connection to organized crime, without explicitly stating what they wanted from him. By early 1937, Romano was living in constant fear. He knew that federal investigators were building a case against him. He also knew that Luciano's organization had ways of dealing with potential informants that were more permanent than anything law enforcement could offer. Romano made a decision that he thought was clever. Instead of agreeing to cooperate with federal investigators, he would simply take enough money to disappear permanently. He had access to several accounts that contained money belonging to the 5 families. If he could withdraw a substantial amount and flee the country, he might be able to escape both the federal investigation and potential retaliation from organized crime. On February 15, 1937, Romano visited 3 different banks in Manhattan. At each location, he withdrew large amounts of cash from accounts that were supposed to be managed according to agreements between the crime families. By the end of the day, Romano had $500,000 in cash, an enormous sum at the time. Romano's plan was to take his family to Europe, where they could live comfortably on the stolen money while remaining beyond the reach of both law enforcement and organized crime. He arranged for his wife and children to meet him at a hotel in Brooklyn, where they would spend the night before boarding a ship to Italy the following morning. Romano never made it to the ship. The theft was discovered within hours. The banks reported the unusual withdrawals to their contacts within the crime families, as they had been instructed to do. By evening, every major figure in organized crime in New York knew that Giuseppe Romano had stolen $500,000 and disappeared with his family. The FBI expected immediate and violent retaliation. Based on their experience with previous betrayals, they anticipated that Luciano's associates would conduct a massive search for Romano. They prepared for the kind of public bloodshed that had characterized earlier gang wars. Instead, they observed something completely different. There were no emergency meetings among crime family leaders, no unusual activity at known mob hangouts, no increase in violence or suspicious deaths. The five families continued their normal operations as if nothing had happened. Frank Costello, who was managing Luciano's interests while the boss was in prison, maintained his regular schedule of meetings and social events. Vito Genovese, Luciano's underboss, continued conducting business as usual. Meyer Lansky, Luciano's longtime partner, showed no signs of concern or unusual activity. The absence of any visible response was more disturbing to federal investigators than any violent reaction would have been. It suggested that Luciano's organization had resources and methods that law enforcement didn't fully understand. What the FBI didn't realize was that Luciano had spent years developing a network that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of organized crime. His associates included corrupt officials in police departments, banks, and government agencies. He maintained business relationships with crime families in other cities and other countries. Most importantly, he had created systems for handling problems that didn't require his direct involvement or risk his legal exposure. Romano had made a fundamental miscalculation. He assumed that stealing money and leaving the country would be sufficient to escape retaliation. He didn't understand that Luciano's power wasn't based solely on violence or intimidation. It was based on information, patience, and resources that could reach anywhere in the world. 3 weeks after Romano's disappearance, a maintenance worker at the Brooklyn docks found an abandoned automobile. The 1936 Buick sedan was registered to Giuseppe Romano. The car had been parked in an isolated area where it might not have been discovered for months. When police investigators examined the vehicle, they found Romano's wallet on the front seat. It contained his driver's license, business cards, and family photographs. In the back seat, they found his wife's purse containing her identification and personal jewelry. Scattered across the floor were children's toys and clothing, but there were no signs of the Romano family themselves. On the dashboard, positioned where anyone entering the car would immediately see it, was a single business card. It was from Benedetto & Sons Funeral Home in Palermo, Sicily. The card appeared to have been placed there recently, as it showed no signs of weather damage or aging. The message was unmistakable. Romano and his family hadn't simply been eliminated. They had been returned to Sicily for burial, following traditional practices for dealing with those who had violated the most sacred codes of organized crime. The discovery of the car and the funeral home card sent shockwaves through law enforcement and organized crime alike. For federal investigators, it demonstrated that their ability to protect potential witnesses was severely limited. Romano had been eliminated despite having access to substantial resources and advance warning of the danger he faced. For members of organized crime families, the message was even clearer. Betraying the organization wouldn't just result in personal consequences. It would result in the complete elimination of the betrayer's entire family line, with the bodies returned to Sicily for burial, according to ancient traditions. The psychological impact of Romano's disappearance extended far beyond its immediate circumstances. Every accountant, lawyer, and business associate connected to organized crime understood that cooperation with law enforcement would result in consequences that extended to their wives and children. This created a system of control that was more effective than any amount of violence or intimidation. The threat of family annihilation ensured absolute loyalty from individuals who might otherwise have been tempted to cooperate with federal investigators. The Romano case also established Luciano's reputation as a crime boss who operated on a different level than his predecessors. Earlier gangsters had relied on public displays of violence to maintain control. Luciano had created a system where problems were resolved quietly, efficiently, and permanently. Meyer Lansky, in later testimony to federal investigators, described Luciano's approach to the Romano situation. According to Lansky, Luciano never gave direct orders regarding Romano's fate. During a prison visit, Luciano had simply mentioned that it was unfortunate when trusted employees made poor decisions about their futures. Within days, associates who understood Luciano's wishes had taken appropriate action. The stolen money was recovered. The security breach was eliminated. The lesson was communicated to anyone who might be considering similar betrayals. This hands-off approach became Luciano's trademark. He created organizational structures that could carry out his wishes without requiring his direct involvement. This provided him with legal protection while ensuring that his authority was maintained even while he was imprisoned. The Romano incident also demonstrated the international scope of Luciano's criminal network. The funeral home card wasn't symbolic. Federal investigations later revealed that Luciano maintained active business relationships with crime families in Sicily, Naples, and other Italian cities. These international connections allowed Luciano to conduct operations that crossed national boundaries and were beyond the reach of American law enforcement. They also provided him with resources for eliminating problems in ways that domestic criminal organizations couldn't match. By 1940, federal investigators had identified patterns suggesting that at least 15 individuals connected to organized crime had disappeared under similar circumstances. In each case, the missing persons had been in positions to provide damaging testimony about illegal operations. In each case, their disappearances had been preceded by approaches from federal agents seeking cooperation. The Romano precedent had created a culture of absolute silence within criminal organizations. Potential witnesses understood that cooperation with law enforcement would result in consequences that extended far beyond themselves. This system had profound implications for the American justice system. Federal prosecutors found it nearly impossible to develop witnesses willing to testify against high-level organized crime figures. The threat of family elimination was more powerful than any protection or incentive that law enforcement could offer. When Lucky Luciano was deported to Italy in 1946, he left behind a criminal organization that had been fundamentally transformed. The chaotic violence of the Prohibition era had been replaced by a sophisticated system of control that operated with corporate efficiency and international reach. The Romano case became a legend within organized crime circles, studied and imitated by criminal organizations across America. The lesson was clear. Ultimate power doesn't announce itself through violence. It operates through fear, precision, and the absolute certainty that betrayal will have consequences that extend beyond the individual to everyone they care about. For Giuseppe Romano, what had seemed like a clever plan to escape both law enforcement and organized crime had instead become an object lesson in the futility of betraying Lucky Luciano. His disappearance served as a permanent reminder to the entire underworld why Lucky Luciano remained the most feared and respected crime boss in America, even from behind prison walls. The business card from the Sicilian funeral home eventually became evidence in multiple federal cases, serving as a symbol of the international reach and ruthless efficiency of Luciano's criminal empire. More importantly, it represented the evolution of organized crime from crude street gangs into sophisticated organizations that could eliminate threats while leaving no evidence of their involvement. The silence that followed Romano's disappearance spoke louder than any act of violence. It announced to criminals, law enforcement, and anyone else paying attention that Lucky Luciano had created something unprecedented. A criminal organization capable of eliminating its enemies without leaving any trace that they had ever existed. If you stayed until the end, you're already part of this story. Subscribe for more true stories like this, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.